Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me is David Griscom. Hello, David.
How's it going, brother?
It's going well. And joining us now is Vaclav Masek Sánchez. He's a Guatemalan Latin Americanist and sociologist. Who I've been following at _Vaclav Masek on Twitter, as Bernardo Arévalo, the president-elect, sort of deals with some obstacles toward getting to the presidency. Vaclav, thanks so much for being here, first of all.
No, thanks, Matt. David, big fan of the show and very happy to be here.
We're really pleased to have you. Now, who is Bernardo Arévalo for folks who haven't been following along?
Yeah, Bernardo Arévalo de León has been a Congress member as Semillas leader, as Semilla is the party, since 2020. Bernardo is also the son of Guatemala's first democratically elected president, Juan José Arévalo Bermejo, who is remembered for being, popularly elected after the 1944 revolution in Guatemala, who deposed a military dictatorship with very fascist tendencies. Bernardo was born in exile in Uruguay after his father and the rest of the revolutionary junta had to flee the country following the US-backed coup d'etat in 1954. We might remember this during the Eisenhower administration against Jacobo Arbenz Guzman. A lot of psychological warfare, sort of the training ground for the Bay of Pigs. And President-elect Arévalo, who is 64 years old, is a trained sociologist, which I really like because I am also a sociologist. He's a doctor in philosophy and social anthropology. And I kind of see him as a structural functionalist in the vein of like Max Weber and Robert K. Merton. So he's concerned with capitalism, but he's hopeful that competition can solve society's problems by promoting stability. Arévalo de León was also an ambassador of Guatemala to Spain between 1995 and 1996. He was a vice minister of foreign affairs in 1994. And between 1984 and 1988, he was a prime secretary and consul to the Guatemalan embassy in Israel. So as we can see, he has a long trajectory in public administration. And he's one of the first guys to ever make it to the presidency with a career, not with clientelistic practices or through nepotism. So this is kind of a breath of fresh air for us in Guatemalan politics.
Yeah, I mean, could you talk a little bit, just for folks who may have not been following as closely, a little bit about the campaign and what was being promised? Because, he sort of went under the radar of polling for a while and was able to put together a pretty impressive coalition to end up winning the election.
Yeah, Bernardo Arévalo was actually elected back in August of this year, and he led a group of idealistic young people who dreamed up an anti-corruption political party while they were still college students. This is sort of a core of the Movimiento Semilla political party. The ruling elite in Guatemala had pushed nearly every opposition candidate off the ballot using this legal trickery. But they left Arévalo on the ballot because they were polling terribly, as David mentioned. So he surprised everyone, and he won by 21 points on the second round. And since then, the Attorney General of Guatemala, which I'll go into detail a little bit later on, has tried to stop him from taking office. They claimed there was electoral fraud, then they raided the offices and suspended his party. And even after the elections had been certified, they ransacked the Electoral Commission. So Movimiento Semillas and Bernardo Arévalo's landslide victory speaks to a question of global importance. How can democratic oppositions win free but unfair elections? One answer, perhaps not very satisfying, is that it's almost by accident. When authoritarian tactics unwittingly backfire, a democratic movement is prepared to capitalize on unexpected circumstances. We can call it the Movimiento Semilla way. And then there's a clear lesson for democratic oppositions in competitive authoritarian regimes in Latin America and elsewhere. And it's that you have to do the hard work, right? You have to prioritize organization and movement building based on principles, democracy, accountability, and transparency. You have to play the long game because you never know when authoritarians might make a mistake. you can't take any shortcuts, so you have to participate in every electoral contest that there is, even though you might be aware that it's unfair, and you don't have to play the odds. Because non-democratic regimes make mistakes all the time, and you have to be prepared. So the way that the campaign worked, to go back to David's question, is that, what we knew beforehand is that we had to replace this very unpopular right-wing government led by President Alejandro Yamatei, who in Guatemala was only constitutionally limited for one term. So that's why the international headlines read after the second round in August, like an anti-corruption candidate has swept to a shock win in Guatemala's presidential election. So anti-corruption was at the heart of the campaign. Semia's main offer was to tackle the deep-rooted clientelistic practices that serve as sort of the grease in the post-conflict state machinery in Guatemala. And so Arévalo's victory is seen widely as a repudiation of the political elite in this Central American nation, which has been long the target of corruption allegations. And going back to the party, right, it was founded in 2017, and Semilla, which is the Spanish word for seed, has roots in this anti-graft protest that rocked the country in 2015. Back then, the Attorney General and a UN-backed anti-corruption commission revealed that there was a high-level graft going on involving the president and vice president at the time. Otto Pérez Molina was a military general, and Roxana Valdetti, who was very close with the bourgeois class, and who willingly resigned and were arrested and put into prison. So corruption and anti-corruption, this has been the heart of the campaign that proved to be very successful. Guatemala still ranks today very poorly in Transparency International's Corruptions Perceptions Index. It's 150 out of 180. So it's tied with Afghanistan and the Central African Republic. So that gives you a sort of a ballpark figure of how good we are at being bad. So recent years have seen a backlash to corruption investigations. Ever since the Anti-Corruption Commission that was backed by the United Nations was pushed away, dozens of prosecutors and judges were forced into exile. Land defenders are being systematically murdered because they are sort of deemed to be, almost terrorists. Journalists are being censored because they talk about these high level of corruption cases in government. And through this context that seemed very gloomy and very dark, Arévalo promised a reversal for this sort of systematic destruction of the justice system in Guatemala. Now the challenge is, of course, and the question remains whether he will be able to assume office on January 14th. If he is able to do so, Semilla only has 23 out of 160 seats in Congress, so he'll have a minority party in the legislature, and he's going to have to create channels of dialogue and possibly reconcile with the people who were once his political adversaries.
Well, so I mean, I definitely want to focus a lot more on this challenge. But before we get there, I did just sort of want to pose this question to you because, on this program and also on our previous work with the Michael Brooks show, we've sort of watched what's called anti-corruption politics. And I've heard it described, in a lot of cases as sort of being anti-politics politics. And what that sort of means is that everyone's against corruption. This is very famously Bolsonaro's run against the PT. It's we got to get rid of these folks. And it's a way to sort of run on people's dissatisfaction with the status quo, but to not also have to sort of put up your own vision of the world, your own vision of politics, or make those kind of promises that might get you into trouble later when people start asking what you've been doing when you win. I'm just curious, how you would maybe compare this campaign and movement to maybe some of those other kind of right-wing populist anti-corruption movements that we've seen across, the Americas and also in Europe.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a totally fair question. And there's a lot of echoes with the Brazilian right-wing populists with what's currently going on in Guatemala. Calling the election a fraudulent contest, trying to use the justice system to undermine the popular sovereignty. So you're totally right. And corruption is this very ambiguous concept when it comes to actually carrying out policies. But the difference with Semilla is that since it's a new party and it's sort of it came into being outside of the sort of the post-conflict party system configuration of ex-military intelligence units, historically landed classes with their own electoral vehicles. It came into being in a moment where mass mobilizations were taking root in Guatemala, and they were very intersectional. You saw indigenous groups, university students, the professional class, all of whom were very clear what corruption meant, and that is using public funds and extracting public funds from the state for their own personal use, right? Essentially using the state as their own private bank and extracting funds that were used for public safety, education, and the health system for their own, and especially contracts, right? State contracts, giving it to their own businesses. Once Semilla was able to articulate this, to sort of make the idea of corruption less ambiguous and more concrete, and people started realizing, Bernardo and the rest of the Semilla gang is kind of onto something, right? Why do we keep electing folks who never fulfill their campaign trail promises, but rather just emerge as this nouveau riche politicians who are never really able to fulfill their promises, but rather just drive nice cars and have, the ability to travel around the world and jet set from one place to the other. And at the same time, the country remains one of the poorest and most unequal in the world, right? Like, it's not only corruption from a visible perspective, but rather very practical. We are unable, to give you a very perhaps mundane perspective. We have one of the least connected highway systems in Latin America. It's very hard to move around Guatemala, and it's a very centralized country as well. We have very few cities. The public health system is collapsing. COVID was, a debacle in terms of how the country tried to respond to this emergency. And even that was a moment where the current administration of Alejandro Yamatei negotiated with the Russians, a very sketchy deal. We never got the vaccines. We used a lot of money. We don't know where it is. And that's why now not only people are very much aware what corruption means, right? Like, you are using public funds for your private use. And they are clear that it's a configuration of folks, right? Like, it's not just politicians that are being elected, but the remnants of the repressive state apparatus after the 36-year civil war that we had in Guatemala, following that U.S.-backed coup d'etat that I mentioned at the beginning. So, traditional elites have benefited from this. So when you talk about corruption nowadays, you're also talking about, business people who are not only the bourgeois class, but are the landed oligarchy. So it's interesting to hear this debate kind of acquire a more concise component, right? We're talking about people who are benefiting from being in the government by becoming richer and richer.
Yeah, let's move now to this lawfare against Arévalo, because I think that kind of brings this full circle, right? The guy running on anti-corruption politics is nonetheless being attacked sort of in a way that we saw Lula, kind of. I don't know if you would accept that comparison, but what's been going on since Arévalo won the election?
So many of us believe that what we're witnessing, unfortunately for Guatemala, the sort of the interim period between when the election is over and before the president assumes office is very, very extensive. The second round of the elections where Arévalo won was in August 20th. So we're still sort of in the midst of this turbulent time. So we many of us believe that there's a coup ongoing against it. The coups in the past were an affair that happened in 2 days, right? Like with a lot of power. You saw tanks in the street, and maybe you saw armies and the security forces trying to generate a change, force a change in the government, ousting the people at the point of bayonets. But in the 20th century, we had a good share of coups in Guatemala, particularly military-backed coups. But now, we're in the 21st century, and all over the world, coups are being conducted by lawfare. I also understand that this might be a loaded term because, as in Brazil, lawfare was, used against Lula. I agree with that. So co-opted institutions are the ones that are carrying out the coup today. Justice institutions that then begin to be used as instruments to enact revenge. And they're used non-objectively, opportunistically, and sometimes even to the point of completely fabricating or falsifying evidence to try to attack somebody to gain the same effect that the old coups that used bayonets had, which is to prevent the people that won to take office or getting elected to office in order to govern. So the results are the same, and that's why we believe that there's an ongoing coup or a slow motion coup, as Bernardo Arévalo himself called it. The means are different, but here in Guatemala, as it was in Brazil, the means are judicial persecution. In Guatemala, it is the Attorney General Consuelo Porras who has practically led the charge or the campaign against President-elect Arévalo, who was democratically elected by a large majority in August, as we said, from taking office. And up until that point, I must underline that the elections have been marked by irregularities, and that's why I called it a free but unfair election. The Electoral Commission disqualified 3 popular candidates, including the front runner in the polls, who was Carlos Pineda, and the most important indigenous candidate as well, Telma Cabrera. So thousands of Arévalo's supporters, were a little confused as to why they got to the second round, but we must consider the context of disqualifying a lot of the candidates that were polling really high. So when he made it to the second round, is when problems started to pile up for Arévalo and Semilla. Authorities suspended his party and launched investigations into how it was constituted. They alleged that it was fraudulently constituted by forging signatures of the original constituents. And from there, officials from the Attorney General's office raided the headquarters of Guatemala's Electoral Commission on 5 different occasions. They actually took out the ballot boxes, which is completely unconstitutional, and it's an affront to democracy. And they forcefully took election materials. Everything was live streamed. So it kind of gives this odd feeling of like watching democracy fall in real time on your feed. So that's why thousands of Arévalo supporters later took to the streets to demand that the Attorney General step down. So again, these trends have continued to intensify as time has gone by. In a Friday vote, for example, last week, the Guatemala's ruling party-led Congress stripped 4 electoral judges accused of fraud of their immunity. So they're sort of liable for penal persecution now. These 4 magistrates, Irma Palencia, Ranulfo Rojas, Gabriel Aguilera, and Minor Franco, left the country out of fear of being, wrongfully prosecuted. And this has been confirmed by immigration authorities. So this move by Congress just recently, as last week, is seen as an attempt to appoint new judges who would oppose Arevalo's election, and is just the latest measure that could hinder the transition of power. And of course, these moves have sparked international condemnation and nationwide protests.
I'm curious, like, who's spoken out internationally and like has Biden? Because I know Biden, with regards to the Lula and Bolsonaro stuff, said, "Hey, don't have the military intervene." And it strikes me as just like one important distinction between the anti-corruption guys is there a solution to have the military come in and solve it, which is what Bolsonaro is and which is Arévalo's. But yeah, what's been that reaction?
Yeah, totally. I'm gonna flip the question a little bit there, because I don't want people to think that it's old Joe Biden who's sort of carrying out this defense of democracy, when in reality,
right,
it is the Guatemalans who have been taking the lead in defense of this electoral process. So as this anti-democratic mafia try to stage a judicial coup to block the president-elect from taking from office, it was a grassroots uprising that fought to defend the popular sovereignty of Guatemala. And this happened on October 2nd. And it was indigenous and campesino groups in Guatemala who launched an indefinite national strike. And this has been historic. Matt and David, I cannot even begin to express how massive and widespread these mobilizations were. They were blocking traffic. They staged sit-ins to challenge the legal pressure, squeezing this reformist president-elect. And in Guatemala City, we saw dozens of Maya and Xinca community leaders who camped in front of the public prosecutor's office. Until today, it's been 57 days since they've been camping out in front of the public prosecutor's office, where donations of sandwiches, hot food, coffee, all the necessary supplies to sort of be able to resist began arriving on the first night. So it's almost been 2 months since this has been going on. And over this first 3 weeks of what we are now calling the Paro Nacional Indefinido, the indefinite national strike, the blockades on major roads reached over 140 points nationwide. Remember how I told you we had a very sort of faulty highway system? We essentially were able to stop the economy on its tracks. And this sent a resounding message to the political elites and also to the bourgeois class, right? Like, we are the majority of the people here, and we can decide when to take direct action, especially because this is a direct affront to the people's political rights, right? Like, we chose this man. We want this man to rule the country. So you saw university students and faculty, healthcare workers, public school teachers, market vendors, various urban and rural civil society groups joining the call from the indigenous authorities at the barricades. It was a beautiful thing to watch and to see happen. And you know, demonstrators have asserted that this is going to continue until the architects of what Arévalo is calling this slow motion coup, which is particularly the Attorney General Consuelo Porras and this special prosecutor against corruption, which is kind of ironic. It's called Rafael Curuchiche, until they step down. So the strike has come after months of growing trend of criminalization, the legal tactics that I mentioned, the institutional intimidation being used to suppress dissent during Guatemala's electoral cycle. So the immediate spark of the national strike came after the raids that we were talking about at the beginning, and where we saw that, you know, the public prosecutor's office officials were taking out the ballot boxes, flanked by the police, forcibly breaking into them and checking vote by vote to see where the fraud was, and sort of these legal maneuvering, which enjoyed the protection of police and thus the collaboration of the executive branch, indicate that the state of Guatemala is unwilling to accept this change, right? And I want to emphasize once again, right, in case it's not clear, the communities that led the call to mobilize the strike are in the western highlands of the country, the site of the historical Quiche resistance against state violence, which dates back to the colonial era. So the 48 cantones, the 48 cantons, is a municipal-wide assembly that serves as the centuries-old indigenous mayoralty, Alcaldía Indígena, in Totonicapán, which is this state in the west of the country, who were the ones that announced their actions first, and everyone heeded their call. So after that, we saw the indigenous municipality of Sololá, which is also in the west, the parliament of the Xinca people, which is on the east part of the country, and 6 other ancestral organizations that represented indigenous peoples in Chichicastenango, which is in the central part of the country, Nevaj, which is in the north part of the country, and the Kikchi territories, which is on the Caribbean part of Guatemala. So essentially, all of the indigenous communities and leadership amalgamated a unified antagonistic front against this authoritarian urge to steal the elections. And this is the most widespread and persistent call to mobilize since the 2015 elections, and the most significant social movement, perhaps, in the 21st century for Guatemala. In 2015, we saw a primarily urban movement in the fight against corruption. But now, on the other hand, we're seeing a pro-democracy movement. And the national strike was born from the communities because they would no longer tolerate these types of illegalities emanating from the state.
Yeah, I'm curious, when we're familiar with the 1954 Guatemala, the United Fruit Company CIA coup, and also the subsequent violence. I was curious how that context, historical lineage, has played into this.
Yeah, absolutely. The right wing of the Guatemalan political class, which is in support of the coup, funnily enough, is using the argument of foreign intervention to sort of push away this idea that, Arévalo will take office because he won the elections fair and square. So now it's being reversed, right? Like what happened in 1954, it's now sort of broadly understood as a U.S. intervention. But what's happening now for these sort of fascistoid conservatives is also understood as the U.S. is trying to intervene here in Guatemala. So it's kind of ironic, right? Like it's only convenient insofar as it benefits our narrative of the events. So what we see on the other side of the resistance, right, indigenous peoples led resistance, 1954 is served as that last glimmer of hope, right? We had 10 years of democratic government, which is called the Guatemalan Spring, the 10 years of spring. And that's the last time where the popular classes, the masses, were able to actively participate in a nation-building project. And this is clear now, right? We cannot have a state or nation-building project without the active participation of the indigenous peoples, of the Mayas, of the Xincas, of the Garífunas, which are the majority of the population. So it's curious and it's fascinating to see how constituencies who have been historically marginalized by the state are coming out to defend the little democracy that exists in Guatemala, which is, inspiring. And that's why, going back to your original question, Matt, the eyes on the hemisphere are in Guatemala. And the fact that the OAS Secretary Luis Almagro is leading the oversight that seeks to guarantee the change of command is a significant issue in regional terms. A situation like this has never occurred in the country because of the fear of corruption, impunity, and organized crime networks. And it is very relevant. Even the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights said that the move to inhabilitate the tribunal, the electoral tribunal magistrates and to stifle the peaceful transition of power is quote, quote, a long list of worrying actions against Guatemala, and is designed to undermine the electoral process and rule of law. Now, the U.S. government has criticized moves from Guatemala's Attorney General and said earlier last month in November that those who try to intervene with the presidential transition will face quote unquote consequences. And the U.S. has done, what is at their disposition, right? They've sanctioned Attorney General Porras. She lost her visa. She can no longer go to Capitol Hill, for example. And there's a bunch of other sort of government-affiliated officials who have also lost their visa. More recently, just last week, the U.S. designated Luis Miguel Martinez Morales, who was the former head of the now-defunct Centro de Gobierno, for engaging in corruption in Guatemala with the Global Magnitsky Act, for some of us who are familiar with that sort of diplomatic instrument, it sort of grants you with a financial death, right? Like you can no longer use the U.S. banking system. All the assets that you have in the U.S. are frozen. And this is because Martinez engaged in bribery and corruption, allegedly, right? Related to government contracts to benefit himself and close associates. And according to Washington, malign actors like Martinez, who many know, and this is not gossip, this is kind of like very well known. He's the outgoing President Alejandro Yamatei's romantic partner, have aimed to subvert the will of the Guatemalan people. So through the Global Magnitsky sanctions program, the U.S. is imposing tangible and significant consequences to discourage corrupt actors. Seems like he might be the first person to get it, Martinez, and this is the closest that you can get to the president without actually sanctioning the president. Like you sanction his boyfriend. So in a way, the U.S. has been good. Like the scar remains from 1954, and I think especially progressives are never gonna forget about that, because what came after were 200,000 deaths from mostly unarmed civilians. But right now, they're doing the best that they can without necessarily using the weapons of war that they have at their disposal.
So I don't want to be so cynical that I can't just maybe think that, maybe some folks are doing a good thing. But I'm curious, like when we hear about the U.S. administration or the OAS. Typically when we're talking about the Americas, that usually is about to follow something really, really nice. I mean, like, I'm curious from your perspective, why do you think there has been such movement? I mean, is it just reflective of like, certainly the social movements, but also maybe like a frustration with the way that Guatemala has been run in recent years? I'm curious your take on that.
No, I'm also extremely cynical about that, David. I mean, the OAS and the U.S. government are no friends of mine, but in times like these, you need any type of assistance that you can get. And unfortunately for us, with what's going on in Gaza and what's going on in Ukraine, Guatemala is not really on the center stage for anyone's sort of foreign policy agenda. So to be getting this type of help is very important for us. And again, right, like they have an ulterior motive to do this. Arévalo is going to face an urgent humanitarian crisis at the beginning of his term. Guatemala has the largest population and economy in Central America, and the United States is the most important economic partner outside the isthmus. So it remains a major source of and transit point for irregular migration and a thoroughfare for criminal groups and illicit merchandise. Guatemala has 1 in 2 children has chronic malnutrition. Sorry, my pup is.
Oh, good.
My pup is having some thoughts about me talking about the U.S. in a good vein. Sorry. And over the population in Guatemala lives under the poverty line. So we're a deeply unequal country, as I said at the beginning. 20% of the GDP is derived from remittances sent from abroad, mostly from the US. So when you have a weakened rule of law and widespread corruption as exacerbating factors, particularly the other factors are poverty and climate change, they're forcing increasing numbers of people to migrate to the US and search for better safety opportunities. So while the Biden administration has sometimes hesitated to act decisively in terms of Guatemala's democratic backsliding, it has played an essential role in this election period, speaking out to support the legitimacy of the first and second round results and condemning election interference. And their ulterior motive is to stifle the sources of illegal migration. Guatemala, during the administration of Alejandro Yamatei, essentially became the southernmost point for the CBP, right? The Custom and Border Patrol have now activities on the border of Guatemala, and many of us scholars who study these types of processes and dynamics believe that the U.S. border now reaches Guatemala. It's as simple as that, right? Like the U.S., whether it's Democrat or Republican, they don't want illegal migrants coming over, especially poor Guatemalans who are gonna put a burden on the social safety net. So yeah, I mean, this is the reason why, right? Like, we want a safe, working country in Central America so as to stop the illegal flow of migrants.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. One final question I have, we sort of alluded to it, but assuming he gets into office in January, talk about the coalition situation and what he might be able to accomplish politically.
Yeah, it's a tough hill to climb for Arévalo if he gets to assume office on January 14th. As I said at the beginning, he has 23 out of 160 seats in Congress, so he's going to have to negotiate with people that he formerly regarded as part of the corrupt class. So that's going to maybe sour some of his supporters, right? Like, well, you said you were not one of them, so why are you sitting down with them and negotiating for, budgetary reasons or whatnot? What is now clear and what is now very exciting, because it is a turning point in Guatemalan politics, is that he's going to have to negotiate with the indigenous authorities as well. They have now reasserted themselves as legitimate actors in Guatemala's political system, and they have the ability, right? Like they can stop the economy and its tracks whenever they want. So they're going to be part of his coalition. And they're very clear about what they want, which is very exciting. They are against multinational extractivism, which is one of the topics that I follow the most. They don't want international companies coming to their communities and depleting natural resources and leaving just big holes in the mountain and dirty air and water sources. They don't want corrupt politicians extracting resources as well from the public administration. So the way that Arévalo will be able to create a coalition goes through legitimating, again, the indigenous groups that have come out in his support. He needs to understand that it's not that the 48 cantones, the Quiche communities in the Western Highlands, are coming out to support him. Rather, he is the embodiment of democracy at the moment, and it's democracy that they're trying to defend. So if he understands the historical significance of what we just went through this past October in Guatemala, and his historical role as a mediator between the old rotten political class and the downtrodden popular masses that are mostly indigenous and Mayan and Garifuna and Xinca, I think he might be able to carry out good things. especially in terms of reform. I don't think it's going to be a revolutionary government like his father did in the 40s and 50s, but rather just, making sure that the democratic backslide stops. The biggest concern for me is that the attorney general remains, if she doesn't resign, right, which is not looking likely at the moment, she will remain in office until 2026. So if you have the legislature and the judiciary against you, you only have the executive branch, and ruling by decree in Guatemala is very, very hard. So as I said, it's going to be an uphill climb, because I am pretty sure that Attorney General Porras will continue instrumentalizing justice and persecuting those who are not aligned with the interest of the traditional ruling class in Guatemala.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Well, Vaclav Masek Sánchez, you can follow him at _VACLAVMASEK. Vaclav, thank you so much. We'll be checking in with you in January to see how hopefully we get this get our Arévalo into office and don't have a massive legal catastrophe on our hands. But thank you so much for all the information.
Matt, David, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and fingers crossed.